Hello, and welcome to Real Talk with Rachel. Today I'm considering the question, why do authors write about the 90s? Recently, I read a book review that sparked my curiosity. In this review, the person questioned why kids' book authors write books based in the 90s instead of contemporary times. They said, who cares? What kid wants to read about the 90s? Why do authors insist on writing about the 90s? I started wondering, why do we enjoy writing about the 90s? I have a middle grade book based in the 90s. It probably won't be my last because, well, here are my conclusions. First of all, does the question even need to be asked? The 90s were the greatest decade. You had grunge rock. You had Beanie Babies. You had hip hop and MTV. You had the Spice Girls and the Riot Girls and girl power. You had women speaking out through music and art and sports and writing and politics. It was like an angrier version of the 70s. What is not to love about the 90s? That aside, why do authors like me write children's books that take place during the 90s? Well, for starters, some of us lived through that time and loved it. And we believe kids today need to know about the awesomeness of the 90s. Secondly, the 90s was a time before the ubiquitous use of cell phones or the internet. So for story purposes, kids had to figure out what to do without a phone. They couldn't watch videos anytime they wanted. They were bored and had to find something to do, which means in a story, a kid can get into a little trouble. They couldn't call or text their friends at all times. Sometimes they didn't even have caller ID, so they couldn't identify who was calling them, and they'd answer the phone only to find out it was a long-winded telemarketer. Their parents couldn't reach them at all times. They had independence, but also dependence in much different ways than kids today. Sometimes we write about that because kids today, and I have 6 of them, need to know what life was like before phones. They need to be grateful for their connectivity, and also know that kids in the 90s somehow survived without the constant companion of electronics. The internet was a new thing. Kids in the 90s couldn't get immediate answers to their burning questions. They had no Google or Siri. They had to go to the library, check out a book maybe, or consult an encyclopedia, and actually dig for information. So teaching kids media literacy can happen pretty organically in a book based in the 90s, where information was much more scarce and you had to go to original sources. It is worth saying, however, that a media literacy book set in today's time is also sorely needed. In all seriousness for this point, if authors write a kid's book that takes place in contemporary times, people ask, where are the cell phones? But the reality is, not all kids have cell phones. My kids don't, not until they go to high school. Cell phones cost money. So some kids don't have them because their parents don't make enough money. Books based in the 90s or a time before the 90s can level the economic field and make sure kids who don't have cell phones don't read yet another reminder of how they're different from their peers. And thirdly, it's history, and history is important. It's hard to believe that books written in the 90s are now considered historical fiction. And even though it's more recent history, significant things happened in the decade that have implications for today. I've already briefly mentioned the Riot Girl movement that sought to erase sexism in punk rock. But there were other things. The hate crime of Matthew Shepard, a young gay man from the University of Wyoming who was beaten, tortured, and left to die in a field. The beating of unarmed black man Rodney King. The murders of Tupac and Biggie Smalls. The Waco tragedy involving a religious sect called the Branch Davidians that happened in my home state, in which 76 people died. Columbine. History is circular, so learning about this history is important. We're still today dealing with securing LGBTQIA+ rights. We're still dealing with inequality among the genders and violence against people of color. We're still grappling with cult-like religion. We're still trying to figure out how to solve school shootings. We can explore these modern-day topics through history in a less threatening way. Historical fiction gives a more comfortable place to explore it. It provides distance, while also providing parallels. It's important to mention that this is not an either-or kind of thing. Just because some of my kids' books take place in the 90s doesn't mean all of them do. Historical isn't better than contemporary, and vice versa. I do have kids' books that take place in today's times. But yes, I will likely write another book based in the 90s. Maybe several. It was, after all, the decade that opened my eyes to injustice. The decade that saw me move from a child to an adolescent to a teenager and taught me to stand up for what I believe in. The decade that made me. And I believe it can do the same for today's children and adolescents and teenagers.